I was lying flat on the cold metal table in the operating room, the blinding white surgical light burning straight into my eyes. So harsh, I wanted to shut them tight but couldn't. My body stiff, not from the chill, but from the suffocating weight pressing down on my chest, as if fate itself had wrapped its hands around my throat. And each beep of the heart monitor beside me struck my skull like a hammer, echoing louder than the soft rustle of papers, the clink of surgical instruments, and the low murmurs from the other side of the observation glass, where Ashley, my daughter-in-law, stood with her parents, Charles and Rose, whispering but never taking her sharp, commanding eyes off me, silently urging me to sign my life away, to do what she had demanded days earlier, donate my kidney to my eldest son, David. I had already signed the consent form with a trembling hand, that thin line of ink a sentence I could never erase, the paper now sitting somewhere on Dr. Thompson's desk as the nurse prepared the syringe filled with anesthesia that glistened under the light like a drop of mercury. And though I closed my eyes, trying to take a deep breath, my chest felt weighed down with lead. I thought of David, the boy I had raised in this small Ohio town, the one I had worked my fingers raw for, the son who once ran barefoot through our modest backyard with laughter that filled the neighborhood, now lying weak and frail in the next room, waiting for my kidney to give him another chance at life. I told myself this was what mothers did, that it was my duty. Yet a gnawing emptiness hollowed me out, a dread I couldn't name, until a sudden slam made the entire operating room freeze. The door burst open with a force that rattled the tray of scalpels and clamps, a gust of cold hospital air sweeping inside, as if the outside world had stormed in to stop time. And there stood Ethan, my 9-year-old grandson, his sneakers caked with mud, his little chest heaving in his wrinkled school uniform, clutching an old cracked cell phone in one trembling hand, his round eyes wide with terror but blazing with resolve. A nurse ran after him, shouting frantically, "Kid, you can't be in here! Stop!" But Ethan ignored her, his small body moving with the determination of a warrior, heading straight for me as if no one else existed, his voice cracking but clear as glass when he cried, "Grandma, I have to tell them the truth about why Dad really needs your kidney." The words detonated in the sterile air, silencing every beeping machine, every moving hand. Even Dr. Thompson, who had just raised his scalpel, froze mid-motion, his brows furrowing as if the world had shifted. A clamp slipped from another surgeon's fingers and clattered against the white tile floor with a metallic scream that sliced through the tension. My throat was so dry I couldn't form a word, my heart battering against my ribs as if it wanted to escape, and my eyes locked on Ethan, the boy I had held in my arms every night, the one who begged me for bedtime stories, now standing at the threshold of shattering our family's facade. Ashley's fists pounded the observation glass, her shrill voice rising in panic. "Don't listen to him! He's just a child!" But I saw the fear trembling in her expression, the cracks forming in her icy mask, the terror of a secret she had tried so desperately to bury, now clawing its way out through her son. Ethan's small hand gripped that phone so tightly his knuckles whitened, his lips quivering, but his eyes locked on mine with a desperation that made my heart break. And in that instant, I saw not just my grandson, but a messenger of truth too heavy for a child to carry, the burden of something I had been too blind or too afraid to see. I wanted to rise, to hold him, to tell him he wasn't alone, but the straps on my wrists held me down, leaving me trapped in that blinding light, forced to watch as the fragile thread holding together the lies of my family began to unravel right there in front of strangers, doctors, and God himself. And in that moment, I knew my life, David's life, and the future of our family would never be the same again. Dr. Thompson, the lead surgeon, lowered his hand slowly, his voice steady but edged like steel as he commanded, "Say it, son. Whatever you need to tell us, say it now." And the entire room, packed with nurses frozen mid-step and surgeons staring with wide eyes, seemed to hold its collective breath as Ethan swallowed hard, his little chest rising and falling with the weight of words far too heavy for a boy his age. And while Ashley banged on the glass, screaming that none of this mattered, that this was all hysteria, I could only stare at Ethan, remembering the nights he curled up in my living room, clutching his toy cars while I mended clothes under a dim lamp, remembering his laughter echoing through my tiny house, unaware that he carried in his small heart a truth that might destroy us all. My mind, in that instant, fell into a flood of memories, pulling me back to the years before this cold operating table, back to my weathered little home on the outskirts of town, where the paint peeled from the porch rails and the smell of disinfectant always hung heavy in the air because my husband, Robert, paralyzed from a stroke more than a decade ago, spent his days in a creaking wheelchair that I pushed out onto the porch for sunlight. His eyes vacant most days, though sometimes a single tear would roll down his cheek, and I often wondered if he was trying to tell me he was tired of being trapped in his silent body, though no words ever came. In that same house, I raised my two sons, David, my firstborn, my pride, the boy who once towered with strength and worked construction jobs to keep food on his family's table, until the day his skin grew pale, his laughter faded, and he confessed one night through clenched teeth that he had found blood in his urine. And Mark, my younger son, quieter, more reserved, working as a plumber and electrician around town, his rough hands always full of grease, but his visits always full of kindness, never arriving without a bag of groceries or a toolbox to fix what was broken, his voice steady when he begged me not to exhaust myself, though I waved him off, insisting David needed more help than I did. Then Ashley came into our lives like a soft breeze that slowly turned into a storm, her pretty smile and gentle voice fooling the entire neighborhood, neighbors at the church potluck whispering how lucky I was to have a daughter-in-law so devoted, always bringing David his medication, making him broth, tucking him in as if she were his savior. But beneath those honeyed gestures, I sometimes caught a flash in her eyes, cold and calculating, like someone working a puzzle only she could see. I remember one night waking to the sound of her whispering outside, clutching her phone, her words sharp and hurried. "Don't worry, it's all going according to plan." And when I stepped outside and asked who she was speaking to, she jumped, laughed nervously, and brushed me off, calling me silly, telling me to go back to bed. And though I tried to believe her, the seed of doubt had already been planted deep inside me. Still, when she walked into my kitchen one evening, her arms crossed, her tone slicing through the steam of my casserole cooking on the stove, and declared, "The doctor says only your kidney matches, Margaret. It's your responsibility. You have to save David." I dropped the spoon I was holding, its clang on the cast iron skillet sounding like the start of a funeral dirge, and I searched her eyes for even a flicker of compassion, but saw only ruthless determination. And when minutes later her parents, Charles and Rose, barged into my house uninvited, their voices booming with judgment as they declared that a mother's duty was unquestionable, that the honor of the family now rested on my sacrifice, I felt cornered, trapped like a stray dog with nowhere to run. That night, David, frail and shrunken in his chair, whispered with a hand colder than winter, "Mom, I trust you'll save me." And his eyes, once bright with dreams of building me a new home, now glistened only with exhaustion and need. And though my throat burned with the words I couldn't say, I nodded silently, feeling the kitchen walls close in while Robert wheeled himself back and forth in the corner, sighing through lips that could no longer form questions or comfort. Even then, when I went out to the porch and found Ethan pushing his toy truck across the cracked wood, he looked up at me with those round eyes, innocent yet oddly burdened, and whispered, "Grandma, what if someone makes you sick on purpose with medicine?" My body froze, my blood ran cold, and though I forced a smile, patting his hair, telling him not to worry, that doctors only heal, his words gnawed at me like termites eating through old wood. And for the next few days, Ashley arrived each morning, her voice sharp as she shoved stacks of medical papers across my kitchen table, her perfectly manicured finger tracing the lines. Here, see? It says you're the only match. There's no time. If you don't decide soon, David could die. And though I tried to focus on the smell of mint tea steeping in my chipped kettle or the rhythmic scrape of my broom on the linoleum floor, her words pressed down on me heavier than any chore. And when Charles and Rose showed up with baskets of fruit they barely touched, settling into my best chairs as if they owned them, Rose's voice slicing the air like broken glass as she sneered, "What kind of mother would let her son die? What will the neighbors say if you refuse?" I sat there gripping the edge of the cable until my knuckles whitened, their threats of shame and dishonor wrapping around my throat until all I could do was nod, mute, as if I were an actress in a play I hadn't agreed to perform. Dinner that night was a silent battlefield. David, pale and weak across from me, whispering with a hand colder than winter, "Mom, I trust you'll save me." And his eyes, once bright with dreams of building me a new home, now glistened only with exhaustion and need. And though my throat burned with the words I couldn't say, I nodded silently, feeling the kitchen walls close in while Robert wheeled himself back and forth in the corner, sighing through lips that could no longer form questions or comfort. After the meal, I watched Ashley snatch David's plate to the sink, washing it quickly, her eyes darting as if terrified someone would notice something hidden there. And later that night, when I passed their bedroom door, I heard her voice, low and urgent. "After the transplant, all the data will be perfect. Don't worry, she won't refuse." My heart slammed against my chest, my hands trembling against the old plaster wall. And though I wanted to storm in to demand answers, I froze when Ashley opened the door suddenly, her fake smile glowing in the dim light. "Still awake, Mom? Just talking to a friend," she said, and walked past me like a shadow carrying a knife. By the next morning, my house felt less like a home and more like a cage. Every sound, the creak of Robert's wheelchair, the tick of the clock, the cries of the blue jays outside, reminded me that time was slipping, that a choice was closing in on me, and I, Margaret, who had always fought for my family, who had scrubbed floors, sewn clothes, and sold vegetables at the flea market just to keep Brad on the table, now stood at the edge of a cliff, being told to jump with blindfolded eyes. And the one person who might save me from stepping over that edge was not a doctor, not a husband, not a neighbor, but a little boy with mud still clinging to his sneakers, a boy who had already seen too much and carried secrets I was too afraid to face. The days after Ashley cornered me in my own kitchen and her parents planted themselves like vultures in my living room felt like walking through a nightmare I couldn't wake from. The weight of their stares and David's weakening body pressing me toward a decision that didn't feel like mine. And yet, life outside those four suffocating walls went on with cruel normalcy. The small-town grocery store still smelled of fresh bread and detergent, kids still biked down Maple Street chasing each other, and I still rose before dawn to pack up the bruised apples and squash from my little garden to sell at the Saturday flea market. My rough hands sorting vegetables with the same muscle memory that had carried me through decades of widowhood and everything but name, since Robert had been locked in silence after his stroke. But my heart wasn't in it anymore. Every stitch of the old jeans I mended for neighbors and every casserole I baked tasted of dread. My mind circling back to the stack of medical papers on the kitchen table, Ashley's sharp voice echoing, "It's your responsibility, Margaret. Don't you dare hesitate." I tried to bury myself in chores, scrubbing the linoleum floor until my knuckles cracked. But even then, Ethan's innocent question rang in my head. What if someone made you sick on purpose with medicine? And though I forced myself to dismiss it as childish nonsense, the seed had already sprouted, watered by the unease in Mark's eyes when he stopped by after a plumbing job, grease still streaking his fingers as he adjusted the ceiling fan, his voice low and cautious when he said, "Mom, something's not right with Ashley. I saw bottles of pills in David's room without labels, and she hides them." Words that made me drop the dish I was washing, shattering porcelain and my fragile hope in one sharp crack. My first instinct was to scold him, to say he was imagining things, but the tremor in his voice, the fear in his steady hands, told me he wasn't lying. And suddenly, Ethan's question didn't feel so childish anymore. Suddenly, the late-night whispers, the hidden bottles, the quick movements at the sink began to form the jagged outline of a puzzle I didn't want to complete. Still, I clung to denial, telling myself Ashley loved David, that she wouldn't harm him, because the alternative, that my son's wife might be feeding him poison while pretending to save him, was too monstrous to accept. Yet, the cracks widened quickly, because the very next day, while I carried a thermos of chicken noodle soup to David's hospital room, I watched from the doorway as Ashley, thinking she was alone, dropped a strange blue pill into his water glass, her hand jerking when she realized I was there, water splashing onto the tile as she stammered, "It's just a supplement, Margaret. The doctor said it helps his kidneys." But when I asked Dr. Thompson hours later if he prescribed anything new, he adjusted his glasses and shook his head firmly. "No, Mrs. Miller, nothing like that." And in that moment, my blood turned to ice. That night, Ethan appeared again. No toy cars this time, no laughter. Just a haunted seriousness in his small face as he pulled out a cracked old cell phone from his backpack, whispering, "Grandma, I want you to hear this." His thumb shaking as he pressed play, and Ashley's voice slithered from the speaker, low but unmistakable. "After the transplant, the result will be perfect. Don't worry, she won't dare say no." My hands trembled so violently I nearly dropped the phone, tears pricking my eyes as I stared at Ethan, who sat stiffly, his little knuckles white as he held onto his backpack like a lifeline, his voice breaking, "I found it on Mom's phone. I thought you needed to know." I gathered him into my arms, my brave boy who shouldn't have to bear secrets darker than most grown men could handle, and I whispered, "You're so strong, Ethan." But inside, my heart was shattering because the truth was clawing its way out, and I didn't know if I had the courage to face it. Later, Mark came by the hospital again, this time pulling me into the corner of the corridor. His eyes red, his voice a hushed growl as he showed me blurry photos on his phone. Ashley in the back parking lot of the hospital, handing a bag of pill bottles to a man in a dark jacket and baseball cap, taking an envelope in return, and though the images were grainy, the sight of those unlabeled bottles, identical to the one I had seen on David's nightstand, made my knees buckle. "I followed her, Mom," Mark admitted, his voice breaking. "I think she's hurting David. I think she's been doing it for a long time." The sterile hospital hellway spun around me, the smell of antiseptics suffocating. And though I wanted to scream, to march into Ashley's face and demand answers, fear glued my tongue to the roof of my mouth. Fear that if I pushed too hard, I would lose David before the truth could come to light. That night at home, I sat at my kitchen table with my face in my hands, the clock ticking louder with every second, while Robert sat in his wheelchair staring blankly at the faded wallpaper. And for the first time in years, I thought I saw a tear slide down his cheek, as if even in silence he knew the walls of our family were collapsing. I went to bed with my mind racing, Ashley's lies, Ethan's recordings, Mark's photos, the mysterious pills all swirling together into a storm that wouldn't let me rest. And by morning, when Ashley barged into my kitchen again with her parents, dressed up as if heading to Sunday church, Rose's sharp voice cutting through the air, "Today's the day, Margaret. The hospital needs your decision. Don't shame this family any longer." I felt something inside me snap, a quiet fury, the realization that I was being herded toward the edge of a cliff, not for love, not for family, but for a plan I was only just beginning to understand. A plan that smelled of money, secrecy, and betrayal. And though I forced myself to nod and pour them coffee, inside, I was already bracing for the moment everything would explode. By the time the hospital summoned me to their conference room for the final consent meeting, my body felt like a shell. My soul scraped raw from sleepless nights of doubt and whispered secrets, and though I walked the narrow hallway with the sound of my worn shoes echoing against sterile white walls, it felt less like I was heading toward a medical procedure and more like I was being led to an execution, because waiting inside were not only Dr. Thompson with his charts and test results, but also Ashley, her arms folded with that knife-sharp look of control, and her parents, Charles and Rose, perched like royalty, nodding at one another as if they had already won. Dr. Thompson laid the lab results on the table, his tone grave but kind as he explained that I was the only viable match for David, that time was running out, that without my kidney, his condition would deteriorate rapidly. And as his words buzzed in my ears, I felt my blouse dampen with sweat beneath my sweater, my head throbbing with the memory of Ethan's recordings and Mark's photos, the image of those strange blue pills flashing in my mind, yet all I could do was nod weakly, whispering, I understand. Because with Ashley's piercing gaze drilling into me from across the room, I felt like a trapped bird too terrified to fight. When the meeting ended, I caught sight of Ashley outside, slipping her phone from her pocket and smirking as she whispered into it. And though I couldn't make out every word, I caught enough. After the transplant, we'll have everything we need. To make bile rise in my throat. But again, fear choked me into silence. That night, I gathered everyone in my small living room under the flickering light of a tired ceiling bulb. Robert slumped in his wheelchair in the corner, his eyes vacant but his presence heavy. David weak on the couch with his head resting against the armrest, Ashley seated proudly beside him, her parents, in the best chairs as always, Rose's perfume choking the air, and Mark leaning silently against the wall, his arms crossed and his jaw clenched. While Ethan sat small in the corner clutching his backpack. I poured tea from my chipped kettle, the steam rising like ghosts, and with trembling hands I announced, I've made my decision. I'll give David my kidney. And the room erupted with reactions, the triumphant clap of Rose as she cried, That's what a real mother does! Ashley's crocodile tears streaming as she buried her face in her hands, peeking through her fingers with fists clenched tight, David lifting his head weakly whispering, Mom, I owe you my life. But before the words could settle, Mark slammed his hand on the table so hard the cups rattled, his voice breaking as he shouted, No! Can't you see? She's using you. This isn't about saving David. It's about her plan, about whatever deal she's running behind our backs. His voice cut through the air like a blade, and Ashley shot to her feet, her finger jabbing at him, screaming, How dare you accuse me? I've done everything for your brother. But Mark didn't flinch, his eyes burning with rage as he stepped closer, spitting out, And what about the bottles I saw? The pills with no labels? The midnight calls? The deals in the parking lot? You think I don't know? David's eyes darted between them, confusion and exhaustion swirling in his gaze, and I sat frozen, my hands gripping the edge of my chair, the walls of my living room closing in as if the truth itself was sucking all the air away. That night, after everyone stormed off in anger, Rose dragging Ashley out by the arm, Mark pacing outside on the porch until his footsteps disappeared into the darkness, I sat alone in my bedroom, the old lamp casting shadows on the faded wallpaper, my hands trembling as I scrawled a will on a piece of lined paper, leaving what little I had, my small house, my belongings, to Mark and Ethan, tears dripping onto the ink as I imagined the possibility I might not wake from the surgery. Robert sat across from me in his wheelchair, silent as always, but when I looked at him closely, I saw a glimmer of moisture in his eyes, and when I whispered, I have to do this, don't I? I have to save David. A single tear slid down his cheek, as if his body, though broken, still carried enough soul to answer. I folded the paper, slipped it into a wooden box with my old wedding photos, and as the rain beat against the roof outside like a cruel drum, I prayed silently for strength I wasn't sure I had, because tomorrow morning the ambulance would come to take me to the hospital, and I feared it would be the last time I ever saw my home. The next morning came draped in a fog so thick it swallowed the small town streets, the wail of the ambulance siren echoing like a funeral procession as I lay on the stretcher with a small canvas bag clutched to my chest, holding nothing more than a change of clothes and the hand-stitched handkerchief I'd kept since my wedding day. And though the paramedics spoke kindly, their voices blurred into static, because all I could hear was the pounding of my heart, every beat reminding me I might be walking willingly into my own grave. The hospital loomed ahead, its sterile white walls gleaming under gray skies, and as they rolled me through the long corridor, the squeal of the stretcher wheels scraping against the tile made me feel like I was being dragged down an endless tunnel. Ashley walking close behind with her heels clicking sharply, her voice dripping with rehearsed concern as she leaned down and whispered, Don't worry, Mom. After this, everything will finally be right. But her eyes glinted with something closer to triumph than relief. Waiting at the front desk were Charles and Rose, dressed as though attending a wedding rather than a surgery. Charles in his neatly pressed suit and Rose in a bright red dress that felt grotesque in the pale hospital light. Their smiles forced yet expectant as they greeted Dr. Thompson with exaggerated warmth. Rose even laughing as she clasped his hand. "Thank you, doctor. Our family will never forget this favor." And the way Dr. Thompson stiffened told me he too sensed something unnatural about their enthusiasm. They allowed me a moment with David before the procedure. His room so cold it bit at my skin, his arms bruised from IV needles, his lips cracked and pale, yet he still tried to smile as he whispered, "Mom, thank you for saving me." And when I took his trembling hand, icy to the touch, I wanted to scream, to tell him I suspected his wife was killing him slowly. But the words choked me, replaced only with the hollow promise, "I'll do everything for you, son." Just as the nurses began to wheel me away, Mark came rushing down the hall, grease still under his nails from a morning job, sweat beading his forehead as if he had sprinted across town, his voice desperate as he grabbed my shoulder. "Mom, don't do this. Please, I'm begging you. Something's wrong. You can't give her what she wants." His words cutting through me, and though my instinct was to collapse into his arms, to say I agreed, I couldn't. Because David's face flashed in my mind, and guilt wrapped its chains tighter. So I only squeezed his hand gently and let the nurse pull me forward as Mark's voice echoed behind me. "Mom, listen to me. She's been poisoning him." My stomach twisted, nausea rising as the scent of disinfectant burned my nose, and as they dressed me in a pale blue surgical gown, the cold fabric brushing my skin like a shroud, I caught sight of Ashley and Rose speaking to a man in a dark jacket by the window, his baseball cap pulled low, his posture identical to the figure in Mark's photographs. And though their voices were hushed, I saw Ashley press a white envelope into his hand while he slipped a small bottle into hers, and my blood turned to ice. But before I could cry out, the nurse tightened the straps on my wrists and pushed me beneath the surgical lights, Dr. Thompson's calm voice saying, "Everything is ready, Mrs. Miller. Just relax," though my body felt like stone. From the other side of the glass, Ashley raised her hand, signaling me to sign the final consent form a nurse held out, and with trembling fingers, I scrawled my name, the ink smearing like blood across the page, my signature feeling less like consent and more like surrender. As I stared at that blurry line of ink, I thought of Ethan's wide eyes, his shaky voice playing me that recording of his mother's chilling words, of Mark's trembling hands showing me those photos, of Robert's tears sliding silently down his cheek, and I wondered if I was about to throw my life away, not to save my son, but to feed the greed of people who saw me as nothing more than a pawn. The nurse held the syringe of anesthesia close, its silver tip glinting under the blinding light, my heart thundering as sweat dripped down my temple, and just as I clenched my fists and whispered a prayer, the sound of a door crashing open echoed through the operating room, jolting everyone into stillness, and with mud still clinging to his sneakers and his small frame heaving from the effort of running, Ethan burst into the room, clutching his cracked phone like a torch in the darkness, his voice trembling, yet loud enough to shatter the silence. "Grandma, wait! They have to know the truth about why Dad really needs your kidney." The entire operating room froze as Ethan's words ricocheted off the sterile white walls, the steady beep of the heart monitor suddenly sounding like thunder in the silence, and I felt my breath catch in my throat as every surgeon, every nurse, even Dr. Thompson, turned their eyes toward that small boy standing in the doorway, clutching his battered phone like a weapon, his chest heaving, his eyes wide with fear but burning with a courage far beyond his 9 years. Ashley's shrill scream tore through the observation glass as she pounded her fists against it. "Don't listen to him, he's just a kid." But her voice cracked, trembling with a panic she could no longer disguise, and Dr. Thompson, brows drawn tight, raised his hand firmly and said, "Let him speak," his deep voice slicing through the tension like a scalpel. Ethan stepped forward, ignoring the nurse who tried to grab his arm, his little sneakers squeaking on the tile as he looked straight at me, his tiny hand shaking as he pressed play on the phone, and suddenly, Ashley's voice filled the room, her words venomous and cold. "After the transplant, the test results will be perfect. Don't worry, she won't dare say no. That old woman doesn't have a choice." The sound hit me like a blade to the chest, and the surgical team gasped, one nurse dropping a tray of clamps that clattered across the floor in a metallic storm, while on the other side of the glass, Rose's face drained of color and Charles tugged at his tie nervously, their active control cracking wide open. "That's not real!" Ashley shrieked, slamming her palms against the glass, but her voice shook, her eyes wild with the terror of someone cornered. Ethan's tears spilled down his cheeks, but he didn't stop, his voice breaking as he cried, "I also have a video! Look!" And he lifted the phone higher, playing a grainy recording where Ashley and Rose could be seen in the hospital parking lot under a flickering street lamp, exchanging a white envelope with the same man in the dark jacket Mark had photographed. Ashley's whisper, sharp as knives, "Once the transplant is complete, we'll have all the data we need, and we can sell the medicine overseas. This money will change everything." My body went cold, every muscle locking as the truth slammed into me like a train. My son's suffering, my fear, my torment, all reduced to a pawn in their scheme, a cruel experiment wrapped in the disguise of family duty. And the room erupted into chaos. Nurses whispering in horror, one surgeon muttering, "My God," while Dr. Thompson's face hardened, his voice booming, "Stop the procedure immediately. This is no longer a surgery. This is a crime scene." Ashley screamed on the other side of the glass, pounding until her fists turned red. "He's lying! He's being manipulated!" But her voice was drowned out by the wail of the heart monitor, the sound of security boots pounding down the hallway, and the sight of Mark bursting into the room, his face flushed with fury, his hands clenched into fists, as he roared, "You poisoned him, Ashley! You've been killing my brother this whole time!" He lunged toward the glass, his anger so raw that two nurses tried to hold him back, but he shook them off, his voice cracking, "You used my mom, you used all of us." David's faint voice drifted weakly from the recovery room next door. "What's happening? Why are you fighting?" And the sound of his confusion broke me into 1,000 pieces. My tears streamed freely as I looked from Ethan's small, trembling body to Mark's furious stance, to the man I once thought was my son's salvation, but was in truth his destroyer. And I realized the truth had finally clawed its way to the surface, unstoppable, undeniable. And though fear had chained me for weeks, in that moment, lying strapped to that surgical table, I felt the chains snap. Because Ethan had found the courage I could not, and the nightmare Ashley had built brick by brick was crumbling in front of us all. The operating room had transformed from a place of sterile order into a battlefield of chaos, the sharp scent of antiseptic now mingling with the raw fear that pulsed through every person present. And as Dr. Thompson barked at the staff to halt all preparations, the door swung open again and two hospital security officers stormed in, their black uniforms stark against the glaring white walls, their radios crackling with static, and without hesitation, they moved toward the observation room where Ashley thrashed like a trapped animal, her hands bloody from pounding the glass, her shrieks echoing down the corridor, "This is a setup! They're framing me!" While Rose clutched her pearl necklace with shaking hands and Charles muttered frantically to anyone who would listen, "You don't understand. We did this for family, for science, for the future." Mark shoved past the nurses, his rage uncontainable, and slammed the door to the observation area open, his voice thunderous as he pointed at Ashley. "Tell the truth. Tell them what you've been feeding my brother." And when she tried to bolt, one of the guards caught her by the arm, her body twisting violently as she screamed, "Let me go! You don't know what you're doing!" But the terror in her eyes betrayed her words. Ethan, still gripping his cracked phone like a lifeline, pressed play once more, and Rose's cold voice filled the room this time. "If the transplant works, the data alone is worth millions. Once we sell it overseas, no one will be able to trace it back here." Gasps erupted from the staff, one nurse covering her mouth as tears sprang to her eyes, and David's weak, trembling voice could be heard again from his recovery room. "Mom, what are they talking about? Did she hurt me?" My heart shattered hearing the confusion in his voice, the betrayal that was only now dawning on him. And though I wanted to run to him, to cradle him in my arms, I was still strapped to that cold table, forced to watch the truth unfold like a nightmare in slow motion. Mark, his fists clenched, advanced on Ashley until security held him back, his voice cracking with grief as he roared, "You nearly killed him! You would have killed my mother too, just for your dirty money!" Ashley spat at him, her face twisted in rage. "You don't understand. This was bigger than us. This was survival." But her words rang hollow, bouncing off the walls with no conviction. Rose tried to intervene, her cane striking the floor with a sharp crack as she shouted, "How dare you accuse my daughter? Margaret manipulated that child to lying. She's the one destroying this family." And she jabbed her trembling finger at me, her eyes blazing with a hatred so deep it sent a shiver through my spine. But Dr. Thompson stepped between us, his expression grave as he said firmly, "Enough. I've heard the recordings. I've seen enough evidence. This ends now. Call the police." The officers moved swiftly, securing Ashley's wrists with handcuffs as she thrashed and screamed, her cries echoing down the sterile hallway, while Charles sagged into a chair, his face gray with defeat, whispering, "It wasn't supposed to end like this." And Rose continued to protest until her voice cracked and faltered, her bravado crumbling under the weight of truth. Ethan clung to me, his tears dampening my gown as he sobbed, "I didn't want you to get hurt, Grandma." And I whispered hoarsely, "You saved me, sweetheart. You saved us all," though my own tears blurred the room into a haze of light and shadows. For the first time in weeks, the straps around my wrists felt less like shackles and more like anchors, keeping me from collapsing. Because though my body shook, I knew the truth had finally shattered the chains Ashley had wrapped around us. When the police finally arrived, their flashing red and blue lights painting the hospital walls like a warning siren of justice long overdue, the chaos gave way to a grim silence. The officers leading Ashley in handcuffs while her shrieks echoed down the hallway. Rose, stumbling after her daughter, screaming curses at me, calling me a traitor, her cane clattering against the tile. And Charles, trailing behind with his head bowed low, his once proud shoulders sagging as if crushed under the weight of his guilt. And though their voices faded as the automatic doors shut behind them, the damage they had done still pulsed through every corner of my soul. Dr. Thompson, his expression solemn but resolute, turned to me and said, "Mrs. Miller, the surgery is canceled. This is no longer a matter of medicine, but of law. We'll begin David on dialysis and new treatments immediately. You've risked everything, but today you saved both your son's life and your own dignity." I burst into tears then, tears I had held back for weeks, as Mark rushed to my side, his strong hands gripping mine, his voice breaking. "You still have me, Mom, and I swear I'll never let anyone use you like that again." And I looked at him through my blurred vision, whispering, "You're my strength, Mark. You always have been." Ethan crawled into my lap, burying his small face against my chest, and I stroked his hair, whispering, "You're the bravest boy I've ever known," while his little body shook with sobs. But in those tears was the fierce truth of a child who had saved us all. Later, when I was finally released from the restraints and brought to see David, he looked up at me with hollow eyes rimmed red, his voice a broken whisper as he asked, "Mom, is it true? Did Ashley really—" And I held him close, rocking him like the boy he once was, whispering, "Yes, son, but you're safe now, and I promise no one will ever hurt you again." And for the first time in months, I felt his body relax against mine, a fragile peace settling between us. In the days that followed, the local papers ran headlines that stunned the quiet town. Small town hospital scandal, illegal drug trial exposed. And for once, my family's pain was not hidden in the shadows, but broadcast for the world to see. Ashley and her parents named as the architects of a scheme to poison David while disguising it as illness, their plot unraveling under the weight of Ethan's recordings, Mark's photographs, and my eventual courage to face the truth. Neighbors who had once praised Ashley for her devotion now whispered apologies when they passed me at the market, their eyes downcast with shame for believing the lies. But I no longer cared about their judgment because I had learned the hardest truth. Blood alone does not make a family. Love, loyalty, and truth do. David began his dialysis, growing stronger with each passing week. His color returned slowly, and though his body bore the scars of betrayal, his spirit started to heal in the warmth of my arms, the quiet strength of Mark, and the innocence of Ethan. One evening, I sat with Robert on our porch, his wheelchair creaking softly as the sun dipped behind the rows of houses, painting the sky in orange and violet. And though his lips could not form words, a single tear rolled down his cheek when I told him everything, and I felt his hand twitch against mine, the faintest squeeze, a silent reminder that even in silence, love could still speak. That night, Ethan crawled onto my lap as I opened my old leather journal, the one where I had recorded decades of sacrifice and heartbreak, and I wrote the final lines with a steady hand. Sometimes family is not the people who share your blood, but the ones who fight beside you when the world tries to break you. I almost lost myself, but I found my strength again, and no one can take that from me. Closing the book, I kissed Ethan's forehead and whispered, "Promise me you'll always speak the truth no matter how hard it is?" And he looked up with those wide eyes and said, "I will, Grandma, because the truth saved you and Dad too." As the crickets sang outside and the night breeze drifted through the screen door, I realized the storm had passed, leaving behind scars, but also a clean sky. And in that moment, surrounded by the fragments of my broken but surviving family, I knew that I had reclaimed something more precious than any organ or sacrifice. I had reclaimed my dignity, my voice, and the unshakable truth that even in the darkest betrayal, courage and love could light the way forward.